Okay, as always, I'm not sure at which second, at which particular moment we're going to go live. I suppose it's going to happen quite soon. I'm checking our connection on a different device. Yes, I think that we're all good.
Yeah.
Okay. Итак, друзья, добрый день, здравствуйте. Сегодня мы начинаем нашу третью часть в серии вебинаров про поиск работы в Австралии. С нами в гостях сегодня Инека Ранги, вот, это специалист, консультант HR. И сегодня наша тема будет «Как подаваться на работу», да, applying for a job, or is it interviews? Yeah, Ineka, yes. Today's topic is interviews. Got it. Okay, so let's get going. Today's topic is interviews, and yeah, we're good to go.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, as always. I'm just trying to navigate a few technical difficulties, which always happens at the last minute. As we mentioned, today's topic is on interviewing. So you've received confirmation that your application was successful, and now it's time to meet people in the series. So as we mentioned, we've had a number of series before, similar to past sessions that we've had. We will make sure that this is available online along with the links to the session so that you can access them at a later date. We are recording this session, so please place any questions you have in the chat function, and I'll make sure that I stop regularly throughout the session to make sure I've answered your questions, or we'll make sure that we work them into a session later on. And I've just had the thumbs up to say that we've got the presentation working, so that's good. So what we are going to cover today is how to prepare for an interview. So whether your interview is face-to-face, so you have been invited to meet someone from the company in person, or it is virtual, which is very common these days with COVID, people working remotely, and hopefully helpful for individuals who are still finding their feet and settling into life in Brisbane, because you can do these interviews from the comfort of the place where you are staying. We also will talk about dress code. So whether it's face-to-face or online, it's still really important that you present a very polished and professional front to the people that you are meeting with, and also some questions to help you prepare, as well as a bit of practice in terms of how to respond to some common questions that get asked in interviews in Australia. So, the interview. What I would like to start by saying is there's a number of stages. Many are considered an interview, which may not be as obvious to you. So in Australia, it's very common that you will apply for a role online, which is submitting your resume and cover letter, which we spoke about yesterday. And then it's very common that you will be contacted by someone in recruitment, or what we call a talent acquisition manager. Often they will give you a phone call, but it could also be an email. If it's a phone call, keep in mind that this is usually considered a phone screen or a first interview, but it may not be addressed that way. So if you answer the phone, it's an unknown caller and you are out at the shopping centre, you are in the park with your children, it is very acceptable to ask if you can arrange to speak to them at another time. So organise another time where it's not so noisy, you don't have the children or the dog barking in the background, or if you're out and about and you'd like to be home in front of your computer, that is very acceptable to ask for that, and the recruiter will absolutely understand that and will schedule another time to give you a call to talk through some of their questions. So as I said, think of it as a first interview. So they will ask you a series of questions to screen you as a candidate before they pass you on for a formal interview. So it's always good to have some notes around you, have your resume prepared, just so that you can remind yourself about the job, the key attributes or experience that they might be asking you about. Once you go through that first screen, you will be invited to attend an interview, and this will be a formal interview, either face-to-face in the office of the company or online, where they will send you a link The most common platforms for an online interview are Zoom, like we're using today. Teams, Microsoft Teams is very common, and also Google, not Microsoft, Google Meets, or finally there's Skype. These are the most common web-based platforms. So if you are applying for a number of jobs, I'd recommend downloading these onto your laptop or your iPad or whatever you're using for applications, so that you have the technology already loaded on, ready just in case, so that you avoid that last minute stress when you've been invited to an interview and you're trying to sort through any tech issues. So when you're invited to this interview, often it's with a number of people. So it could be a hiring manager, a supervisor. Usually there's between 1 to 3 people interviewing you. So there's a bit of technique in terms of speaking to multiple people in person and online, which we will talk about shortly. It's very common to have 1 or 2 interviews, usually no more, unless the company offers for you to meet someone that you would be working with. That would not be considered an interview, but could be another stage of the process, so that you get familiar with the company, the culture, and how they typically work. So there are some other screening techniques that might happen before an interview. As I said, there's the phone call, the first interview, but sometimes there's a values assessment or psychometric testing, which sounds really scary, but really, if you think about it, it's like an online quiz or online games. And you can actually request from the recruiter to flag that you're not comfortable completing the assessment in English, or could they take that into consideration, that English is your second language and not your native language. And they'll make sure they make some adjustments for you so that you have the best possible chance at going through these tests. The values testing is becoming more common, but usually it's mostly large organisations like banks, professional services. And an easy way to get prepared is to have a look online at that company's website to make sure you're familiar with the language that they use, the phrases that they use, to make sure that, again, you can have that Google Translate to make sure you really understand what it is that they're talking about, so that when you do the assessment, you're using language that you're comfortable or familiar with. But as I said, it's something that you should flag if you feel nervous or uncomfortable. If there's a time limit, perhaps you could have a longer time to complete the assessment, so that you're comfortable, you're translating the terms, and that you're putting your best foot forward, as we say in Australia, for these assessments. So going into the interviews. So some tips here I've tried to put on the screen around whether it's in person, face-to-face, or virtual. So if you're invited to attend in person, it's usually at the company office or a neutral area like a coffee shop or a spare meeting space, which is really common these days for companies to save costs on real estate, and they have a shared area with a number of other companies that they might meet you with. Virtual, as I mentioned, online, these are the most common platforms. So as I said, try to have them on your laptops already, just to avoid any stress that might happen with compatibility. Some key tips here, really obvious, I would say, but just to be prepared. So you will feel more comfortable and more relaxed if you have prepared. So you have got everything needed for the interview, you've researched the company, you know who's interviewing you, and as I said, you've removed some of the distraction or noise, so you don't have a dog barking outside, the bin's been emptied. If you know what time the bins are emptied around you, it can be quite noisy and quite distracting. Or if there's a child climbing underneath your desk, pulling at the cords, or pulling at the pillow that you've got your laptop resting on. They're all really common things, but if you can try and prepare as much as possible, that's a key to success. Also, to be mindful in that preparation is your digital presence. So we talked briefly about this yesterday, but it's making sure that your social media and your LinkedIn platform is presenting you as the most professional you possible. So removing any of those pictures from when you were 21 and you were out drinking with your friends, your new employer doesn't need to see those, so make sure that they're private. LinkedIn, make sure you've got an updated photo, you've got updated contact details so that a prospective employer can actually reach you. Because often they will do their research as well. So they will prepare for an interview by having a quick Google to have a look who you are, what your presence is online, and LinkedIn would be the first platform they would search for you. So making sure that you've got that ready to be viewed. Something that's really important is to be prompt, be on time, make sure that you've given yourself enough time to get there and get settled. It's always stressful if you're arriving late because the bus was late or you were having internet issues, or like you saw me at the start of here trying to get the presentation up. It's quite stressful. So try and leave yourself enough time so that you can just get relaxed and ready to start. Often it's very common for physical or in-person meetings to have a handshake. Make sure that you shake the hands of every person that you're meeting with. They will often offer their hand first. I know it feels a bit strange in COVID, but I'm sure there'll be some hand sanitizer around that you can quickly disinfect if you need to. Otherwise, if it's virtual, then think of a virtual handshake or an opening line. Like it's so lovely to meet you. Thank you for this opportunity to have an interview. Just have a prepared first line, which is your virtual handshake, if you like. Body language is really important. If it's in person as well as virtual, so making sure that it's an open body, you try to look as relaxed as possible. Try and keep your responses quite short and concise, to the point, which I think is more of a problem for native Australians than for people migrating to Australia. We tend to be a bit fluffy, as we've been described, but stay to the point, they'll appreciate it. Check for understanding. It is absolutely okay after you've answered a question to check that you answered it correctly, or would they like you to expand. They'll be very accommodating, knowing that you're interviewing in a language that isn't your native language. So that's completely fine to ask after a question. If you understood it correctly, would they like you to expand? They're very common sayings. It's also important to have some questions for them. At the end of the interview, it can often be quite awkward when they say, have you got any questions for us? And the interview candidate goes, no, not really, and just sits there. So I've got a slide later on with some tips and some questions that you might want to just have prepared so that you can fill that silence at the end of the interview. Shows that you've done your research and that you're engaged and you want to find out more about the company or the people interviewing you. And then it's very important, the close. So again, thank you for your time. I appreciate this opportunity. A handshake to say goodbye if you're in person, or if it's virtual, I look forward to hearing from you soon. So again, these are just some tips, and I've included a link there at the bottom if you'd like to read more. There's some great articles online that talk about these tips as well. As I mentioned, eye contact is really important, so engaging with each of the interviewers. If it's on a virtual screen, it's sort of, you have to keep going around the screen to make sure you're looking at everybody, but also eye contact the other way. Try not to be put off or distracted if the people interviewing you are taking notes. So they're not making eye contact with you all the time. They need to take notes to remind themselves of key things you've said or things to ask you to expand on. It's not a bad sign at all. Just like you might like to take some notes, they might like to in return. Try as much as you feel comfortable to build rapport, or try to show a bit of your personality in the interview. It will make you more relaxed. It will make them more relaxed, because interviewers get quite nervous as well. But also it might lead to them asking you some questions later on and getting you more comfortable and familiar, which might help put you ahead of other candidates that they're interviewing. So another great tip, which I should have put on here, is practice, which I know we've been hearing our whole lives when we were at school, if you went to university, but absolutely practicing in an interview will help you feel more comfortable and familiar, not only with responding in English, but also just how you might refine your answers to be more concise, more to the point, more relevant. So I would really recommend doing that. So we have here some interview questions. Now, there are some really common questions that get asked in interviews. Things like, tell me about yourself. That's usually an opening question. What prompted you to apply? So why did you apply for this job over another job? Why do you think you would be a good fit? So when you're preparing your responses for these questions, which I would recommend you do ahead of time, even before you apply for jobs or while you're applying for jobs, because these are fairly standard that you see across a number of industries, have them written down. That's totally fine, just as you start to work through your responses. Think of this as it's all marketing. It's marketing yourself as the ideal candidate for them to hire. So a really tricky question, number 4, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? When you're responding about your weaknesses, they still need to be in a positive tone. So something that I have used for a number of years, so I hope my boss isn't listening to this, I always say one of my weaknesses is I struggle to not finish things, or I struggle when things aren't finished or done, which for me actually really is a challenge because I will stay up all night until it is done. But for a boss, that shows that, great, she's committed. Yes, that's a challenge, but it shows that she'll get the task done. So when you're thinking about a weakness, try and put a positive slant to it as you can, or something that you're willing to address or you're aware of it, so that you are showing that you're dedicated to improving yourself in that area. So there are some hyperlinks there to more examples of some common questions. So as I said, as a bit of homework, just practice responding to those, write some notes down to remind yourself, because there are some really common ones there that, as I said, no matter if you're applying for a role as a chef in a restaurant, a security guard, a lawyer in a law firm, a marketing manager, it's guaranteed you'll be asked one of these questions, so it helps to think about them ahead of time. Some tips on how to respond to these questions. A very common technique in Australia and in the UK and the US is the STAR technique, which is what I have on the right side of the screen. And STAR is an acronym that stands for the situation, the task, the action, the result, and if you want to go for extra points, what's the strategic link? So that's usually for more experienced or senior roles, but how do you link your response back to the strategy of the organisation that you're applying for? So their mission, their strategic goals. So if it's to reduce carbon emissions or to ensure no child is homeless or something like that, how can you frame your response so that at the end you link back to the strategy, so the company goes, great, they're already aligned with what we're trying to achieve, they're a fantastic candidate. So if I move to the next slide, I've actually found a great article on Hays where they have published a number of those really common questions that we had before on the earlier slide, and they've stepped them out here to give you an example response. So a really common question you might be asked is, can you give me an example of a problem that you have helped your organisation resolve? So it could be everything from, my restaurant kept running out of the favourite dish at breakfast, or it could be, my company was trying to achieve 0 carbon emissions in the year. 2 really different ends of the spectrum, but this strategy works for both. And so this example here is, as you can see, they've stepped it out in terms of how you would respond to this problem. Our email marketing click rate was well below the industry average for the past financial year. So you've given them a situation, you've given them a context to explain your response. Then the task, my manager wanted me to turn this around. And then the next level, I refined our email marketing template so it was more intuitive and direct in calling our audience to action. So that's the action that you performed. An employer doesn't want to hear about what your team did, what your colleague did, what your manager did. Make sure the action is you, what you did to respond. And then finally, to wrap it up, our click rate exceeded industry averages in the next financial year. We performed better than we had in 4 years, and our sales revenue from emails increased. That's the result. So that is your response to that question. So it's 1 line for each of the STAR attributes. So I would recommend, when you're practicing some questions, have a look at these responses on this website, which I've linked there to give you some ideas, but try and practice the star technique. So even write star down the page and write a sentence after each letter to try and refine your answer. So it stops you from wafting on, trying to think of the right words. It has it all there, concise, ready to go. If you're asked a question in an interview where you don't have a relevant work example to respond to, think about if you've done any volunteering work or if you've got a hobby. So an example I used yesterday, if you coach or used to coach a soccer team, or if you've got a personal experience, feel free to use that as an example if you don't have a relevant work one, but try and keep work at the top. And then you can use an example in your personal life to try and address the question as well, because that shows that you have transferable skills, you've understood the question and you're able to respond in that way. During the interview, it's also very acceptable if you want to write down the questions as they ask you so that you have time to prepare, digest in your head, and you can look back down at the question to remind yourself and help you answer it. And you can tell them that's what you're doing in the interview, and that is fine as well. You can also have some pre-prepared examples that you might want to use as they come up. Just make sure that they're relevant and that you're responding to the question asked rather than the question you'd like them to ask. So showing that you're listening. So I might pause just because that's a lot to take in. Are there any questions before we move on?
We have a question about how many candidates usually get invited to an interview.
It's a great question. It really depends on the role and the organisation. It could be one candidate, it could be 10, 15. It really depends on the size and the role. The more senior the role, so higher up in the company, the fewer candidates usually they interview because they try to pre-screen. So you're only being invited to an interview if they think that you're suitable for the role based on what they've read. And really it's just about putting a face to the resume that they've read and just checking for cultural understandings and fit with the firm. So it could be 15 people that you could be compared with, which is why it's really important that you feel as comfortable and prepared and relaxed as possible so that you put your best self forward.
So usually it's around 15 people for a position in Australia.
That would be the maximum. I wouldn't personally want to interview 15 people because that's a lot. If each interview is an hour, that's spread across 2 days. That doesn't give me time to go to the bathroom. It doesn't give me time to eat lunch if I need to commute to and from. So 15 would be really high, but that's probably the maximum they would say. But usually when I've done interviews in the past, we usually speak to 3 people is sort of what I prefer. Because I think if you're speaking to more people than that, then you probably could cull out a few more candidates that maybe aren't quite right beforehand. Yeah.
Right. And how many rounds of interviews should people expect for different roles?
I think for a skilled role, so something that requires previous experience and potentially a qualification like a degree, 2 interviews is very common. If it's a unskilled role, like working in a cafe, a restaurant, I think 1 interview is very, very, very normal. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's it for now.
That's okay. So I also put this up, not to scare you, but just to make you aware, particularly in smaller companies, they might not be as polished and professional in their interviews. And there may be some questions they ask you that they shouldn't be asking you. And so here's just a really easy page that I found online around how you can politely respond to some of these questions that should not be asked. And the reason I say they should not be asked is, if you remember back to our first session that we ran, we talked about our national employment standards, which are a set of guidelines to protect employees, but also to give employers a guide around what's acceptable and what's not in terms of minimum standards. And in that, there are a number of protected characteristics. And protected characteristics mean that employers cannot discriminate for potential candidates, as well as people who are already employed, on a number of these characteristics, like gender. If you can't pick a man over a woman just because you feel like it, it needs to be directly related to the capability and core requirements of a role. But another characteristic is age, religion, so what religious beliefs people have, sexual orientation, so do they identify under the LGBTIQ, for example, which means are they in a same-sex relationship or a heterosexual relationship? You can't, as an employer, decide to hire someone or not hire someone based on that. So here are some examples where if you get asked this question, here's just a suggestive response, like, how old are you? Unless that is directly relevant to the role, which the majority of the time it should not matter, you can turn it around and say, are you asking how many years experience I have? Rather than saying, are you asking that because I have grey hair? There's a way to do it politely and to turn it into a more positive response. But it's just something that you should keep in mind, being new to Australia and Australian culture, that some smaller companies may ask you these sorts of questions, and that's not okay. But if you're still really keen on wanting the job, here are some ways that you can respond in a polite, respectful manner, and then you just move on. What I would mention is if you might have a physical or a hidden disability, so you might have hard hearing, or you might have a hidden disability, so something like something mentally might challenge you slightly. It's okay when you're having that phone screen, so when the recruiter calls you, to mention that so that they can make adjustments for the interview. So if it's physically hard for you to access a building with stairs, that's something that you should raise before the interview is set. So they might meet you at a coffee shop or somewhere easier to meet, for example. Or if you're hard of hearing, they will make sure that they don't have any background noise that could interfere with the interview and your ability to hear them. So please feel comfortable and supported to raise any of those concerns that you might have, so that your future employer can make sure that they've made some adjustments which are completely acceptable and very common, very, very common in Australia when applying for roles. So I'll just stop. Were there any questions before I move on? Because that's quite a serious matter. Okay. So this might seem really lighthearted and fun, but I thought it was really important. And I thought particularly for anyone who hasn't made it to Brisbane yet, nothing I say can prepare you for how humid and hot it is in Brisbane. And Tanya's nodding her head because it is very hot, or what we call muggy, which means hair's frizzy, get a bit sweaty. So preparing what you wear is really important. Really important, more so I think sometimes than if you were applying for a role in one of our other cities, because where we are, it's very tropical, it's very hot. Sometimes it's hard to dress professionally because it's just, even in winter, can be really, really hard and hot. So some tips I have here is to do your research first. If it's going to be a in-person interview, go visit the office, walk around the area or the suburb where it is. I'll still remember my dad taking me when I was 14 for my first job, and we walked around the shopping centre first so I could see what other people were wearing. And I still use that technique almost 2 decades on. So it's a big thank you for my dad for teaching me that. But it's really important so you can see what other people are wearing. You don't want to be underdressed because that can make you feel uncomfortable, but also it could be distracting for your interviewers. If it's an interview in the city, so the central business district, go and walk around and see what other people are wearing. In Brisbane, it's very common for people to have no sleeves because it is so hot. If it's a more formal job you're going for, you can always have a jacket and put that on when you arrive, but you don't want to turn up to the interview sweaty and disheveled because you're just trying to cool down, and it's so hard, trust me. It's very, very hot, and they will understand, but there's ways that you can be more comfortable. Also, if you're applying for a tech role, it's quite possible that it's a more relaxed environment. T-shirts, jeans are totally acceptable. If you're applying for a job in a law firm, suits are still very common practice. If you can't physically visit the location where the company is, have a look on the company website for staff pictures, or social media is another great tip. There's some great articles on Pinterest, Instagram of examples of interview outfits, and I've taken a screenshot there for one to give you some tips, and that was just from Pinterest. I would say it's something that you want to make sure you're comfortable, particularly in person, but also if it's virtual. Remember, they can still see you from the waist up, so making sure that your top half is as professional as you can. And, you know, it could be fine if you have your pajamas on the bottom half and they don't see it. Just make sure you don't stand up midway through to shut the door or enter the door or turn the light on. But trying to make sure that it's what you're wearing isn't distracting to the people you're getting interviewed by. You don't want to unexpectedly or accidentally offend someone by, if you're a female, having a really revealing top when that's all they can see, and it's really hard to look at the candidate and hear what you're saying when that's all they can see. Similarly, if you have lots of tattoos, you have lots of piercings, see if there's a way that you can have these covered, or take the piercings out just for the interview until you get to understand how relaxed the environment is, and it might be totally acceptable. If you're in person, so an interview in person, consider if you're wearing perfume or aftershave, not putting too much on, because again, that smell could be really distracting to the interviewer. So less is more, I would say, in that situation. The other thing I mentioned earlier about the humidity, so the weather here in Brisbane, wearing too much makeup or really thick makeup will make you very, very hot, and it will drip off your face. So again, just keeping in mind the weather, check the weather before your interview, make sure that you're comfortable, but give yourself a bit of time if you're traveling to an office to just touch up before you go into the interview, just to make sure that you're as comfortable as possible. But I can tell you from working in the UK, I wear a lot less makeup in Australia than I did in the UK because of the temperature difference alone. So that's a tip for the females. And for men, again, the sweat patches, if you've got a jacket, don't wear your jacket while you're traveling. Put your jacket on once you arrive. It also avoids, if you've had any children, putting grubby food hands all over you. Put your jacket on last so you're as professional and clean as you can be for your interview. I mentioned yesterday a company called Suited to Success, and I've linked to their website again. If you've traveled to Australia and you don't have all of your luggage with you, or you're worried you don't have something suitable or appropriate to wear to an interview in person, this is a great organisation that you can meet up with, and they support people newly arrived to Australia applying for roles, and they will give you some styling tips on what to wear. And they have wardrobes that you can hire or you can buy very, very cheaply that have been donated, so that you have the best possible attire to attend your interview with. So they are a great organisation. It's a not-for-profit, but they will help you with outfits if you're worried that you don't have something appropriate for the interview there. As I mentioned, make sure nothing's too revealing, but also make sure that what you're wearing reflects you. If you're not comfortable in what you're wearing, they will be able to tell, and it will show through your interview that you're not quite comfortable. So you don't want to distract the interviewers, but you also don't want to distract yourself. So choose fabrics that are comfortable, breathable, something that you own, that you feel comfortable in. A power suit is a very common term, but it makes you feel powerful, makes you feel in control, and makes you feel like a great candidate to apply for the role. Cleanliness is important. So as I made a joke about children putting their grubby hands on you, it's very common, it's part of life, but if you can, try and avoid it for an interview, so it shows that you've prepared. Grooming, tattoos, piercing, I've mentioned already. So I'll just pause there. Were there any questions on what to wear? No? Great. My last bit on this topic would be, it's always better to be overdressed than underdressed. So if you're not quite sure, stick to the more formal side than the informal side. But similarly, if you're going for a really casual role in a cafe or a restaurant while you're still finding your feet, you don't need to wear a full suit. They would not be expecting you to turn up with a jacket or a tie. That's not necessary. Okay. So, things to bring with you to the interview. So whether it's in person or virtual, I've tried to put some tips here on the screen, but always check what is needed when the interview is confirmed. It's very common practice in Australia that after you've had that phone call inviting you to the interview, that screening phone call I mentioned, they will follow up and send you an email. And in that email will confirm the time, the place where the interview is, who is interviewing you, which is great because then you can do a bit of Googling of who's interviewing you to try and get a bit of an understanding of their background, where they sit in the organisation. They will also confirm if you should ask for a particular person when you arrive at the location. And also they will specify if there's any items they wish you to bring. So they might ask you to bring your passport. They might ask you to bring steel cap boots if you're applying for a role in construction, because they might take you on site and they need you to have the appropriate safety attire. So they will specify in this email anything that they want you to bring. Here are my tips as a minimum. If your meeting is in person, bring a copy of your resume, bring a copy of any qualifications that you have, and preferably if you've had them translated into English, or at least mention that you're happy to have them translated into English. Any work examples, if this is relevant. If you're applying for a role in tech and you need to direct them to your portfolio online or some work examples online, fantastic, give them the link. Also a neat notepad or compendium, which just means a folder with pages in it, is a good idea for you to be able to write down questions as they're asking you, but also anything that you might need to follow up on. So taking a messy notepad like this is just going to be distracting because they're going to try and read what you're writing upside down because it looks messy, but there's colours and it's interested. So something nice and plain and simple, and a pen obviously as well. Shows that you're prepared, you've thought about it, and you're ready to have the interview. If it's virtual, great, because it means you can have a whole lot of things outside of the screen to make you feel comfortable and prepared. That won't look messy like it was in person. So if it's virtual, I would recommend having the job ad or the role description, so the job that you applied for, and having highlighted key things that you want to address in your interview that they mentioned in the ad of who they're looking for. Have a copy of your resume and again, highlight relevant experience you want to talk about. What we mentioned earlier around some work examples, make some bullet points. So if they ask you a particular question about, tell me about yourself, explain a really challenging situation, when have you managed a team, you've already got some pre-prepared points to remind you and help you respond. So that's fine to have, again, somewhere in front of you around your desk that they can't see on the screen. Proposed responses, I mentioned, have them in bullets. If you have it in sentences, you'll end up reading it and it will be really obvious that you're reading and you're not looking at the interviewer on the screen. And also have the company website up on your screen, or if you've got the luxury of a second screen, have the company website up if there are some things that you want to mention or reference to show that you've done your research. Annual reports. So each year in Australia, large companies need to publish their annual report. So how has the company performed? What is the company's strategy? What are they looking forward to the year ahead? These are great things to refer to and mention in your interview. Again, being early is really important, whether it's in person or online. Online, it just avoids any tech issues. If it's in person, you account for if your bus is late or you can't find the entrance to the building. That has happened to me more times than I should admit. But if you have to walk around the block several times, you want to make sure you've left time for that so that you can sit down, get centered before your interview. Are there any questions around what to bring along? No? Okay. So then, questions you should ask. So typically the structure of an interview is they will open, they will welcome you, they will introduce themselves, they might give you a brief description of the role, the company, who they're looking for, before they then start asking you questions directly. At the end, they will almost always ask you if you have any questions. And the amount of interviews I've sat in where awkwardly this very stressed person has looked back at me and said no, and it just, as a person recruiting, they haven't prepared, they haven't done their research. Always have some questions prepared. I've listed some up here as suggestions. My two favorites are, is there anything else you would like to know? So that gives them an opportunity to ask you for more information or ask something further that you may not have mentioned or thought to discuss. So it gives them a window to ask you more questions, takes a little bit of the pressure off you for a moment. But then my absolute favorite question is, why do you work for the company? So you asking an interviewer this question shows that you're interested. It allows them to give you some insight around their personal decisions, the company values, what it's like to work there. It shows that you're prepared, you've done your research, and you are trying to, again, build rapport or get to know the person that is interviewing you. But I absolutely love being asked this question, and I think it's great for you to get some insight on the company. When people ask me, I say, I love the people. I've been at my company for 10 years. I've built some great friends. I've had great opportunities and projects to work on. I've got to move overseas and get experience overseas with my company. That's my response. But it's a great question for you to ask, and it's suitable no matter what the role. So whether it's to be a kitchen staff, whether it's to be a lawyer, to work for a tech company, marketing, that will translate into any industry, that last question. So that would be my hot tip there. Now, I've just put up some useful links here at the end. As I mentioned again, Suited to Success is a great service for styling and clothing, particularly if you haven't been able to bring a lot of personal items with you, or if you're still waiting for luggage to arrive, or if you had the luxury of being able to organise a shipping container before you left home. This is a great way to pick up some really stylish tips and clothing very, very cheaply, where people have donated them. But also they offer career support there as well. So Suited to Success is a great organisation. I've also linked to Hudson, to Seek, and some other company searches, which are great. So you can actually see the top companies people have voted for in Brisbane. So if you're not sure where to apply, what roles to narrow your search down, here some employees have actually voted their companies as a great place to work, and you can actually read some of their comments around why their company is so fantastic. So I'd recommend having a look at that just to see if that's a company that suits your industry or where you're looking to apply. So hopefully this was useful. It feels like it went very quickly. As I said, get to know the company, get to know who is interviewing you, so you've done a bit of background on them, see if there's any common experience that you can relate to and bring up in the interview. They will have done their background on you, so it's good for you to do the same. Draft up some work examples and suggested responses to some of those key questions. Practice the STAR response technique to help you and see, again, if there are any gaps that you think you might need to address with some online courses, some volunteering, things like that. But practice. So set up a virtual meeting with a family member, have a catch-up, see how they're going, but then also practice responding and doing an interview in English just to get familiar. There are also some services that will help you with interview practice as well. If you feel like you'd like someone else that doesn't know you and will maybe be more constructive and helpful, then maybe family could be a bit critical. You can try them out as well.
What are these services that can help you with interview practice?
So Suited to Success is a great one. So they offer that as well as the clothing. They actually help mentor and support people with practicing. Another one is on Hays, Hays. That was where I put those question examples before. Hays actually have a service that you can reach out to, and they will do virtual meetings to help coach you through some responses. So they're fantastic as well. And these are trained professionals. They do this every day. And sometimes, as I said, it's easier with someone you don't know than with a family member. So they can help you there.
Lovely, thank you. Inika, do you have any tips about panel interviews? Because this is a less common type when you have several people interviewing you, especially if they are from different backgrounds, like someone is a technical specialist, someone is an HR specialist, and so forth. So how should people address them? Who is making a decision? How do they liaise with each other in a team?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, because panel interviews are very, very common in Australia, particularly for skilled jobs. So skilled jobs that require experience and qualifications, very, very common. And you absolutely nailed that there. There's usually someone from HR, like myself, sitting on those panels. There's usually the hiring manager, who's a bit more senior. And then sometimes there's someone who's the same grade to the grade that you're applying for, or maybe slightly more senior, but they like to put that third person on those panels to make you feel more comfortable, like there's someone that you can relate to. I'm not sure if it always works, but that's the reasons behind there. And so it's really tricky. It takes practice. As I said, you need to make sure you make eye contact regularly to all of them. And so it doesn't mean every question you're doing this to all three people, but make sure that you respond to them, you're looking at them. If one person's got their head down taking notes, look at the other person. In terms of the key decision makers, it would be at least two of those people. So there's not one person that you should favour over the other, because it's really important to treat everyone fairly and respectfully, because even if I've mentioned this earlier, but if you're short or seen as rude to the person at reception that meets you, that's not interviewing you. That feedback can go to the people that make the decision around hiring. So make sure you treat everybody, regardless if they're the person bringing you your coffee while you wait for the panel, or the CEO, the boss of the company. Treat everyone respectfully, and the same would be my advice. In terms of what's trickier is if you're going for quite a technical role, it's very easy to direct your questions and your answers to the technical person on the panel. And a lot of the time I've sat in interviews and I have no idea what they're talking about. I have no idea what this web platform is, or this system, or this topic. And I smile politely and I'm nodding and I have no idea what you're saying, but I still write it down. But really, that person's on that panel for a reason. They're still as important. And it really shows your understanding if you're able to describe a really technical component about the role or your experience to someone who has no idea. So a good way to practice that, if you're in IT, try speaking to your mum, your dad, your grandfather, and see if they can understand. And if you can explain it to them that they understand, then that's a great way to practice for an interview. Mm-hmm. My mum can't even work a mobile phone, so I practice explaining terms and helping her with technical things. And I figure if she can figure it out, then I've shown that I really deeply understand and I can work with anybody. So teams that you are being hired into will be very diverse. So different backgrounds, different ages, different experience. And so it's really important to show that you are comfortable working in that really diverse environment. So make sure you address everybody, you're polite and courteous to everybody. Try and simplify terms that you're explaining as much as possible without losing the essence of what it is. That would be my advice. But also try not to get too stressed or distracted by it's, there's a big power difference with 3 people versus you. Try to feel as comfortable as possible. My tip, they will be nervous as well. I have been doing interviews for 15 years and I still do get nervous when I interview someone. I feel for them. I want them to feel comfortable. I try to make jokes to lighten the situation, to make it easy for them. But they may not be as nervous as you, but they will still be finding it stressful. No one likes an interview. They really, really don't. No one gets up in the morning and wishes to do an interview. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, thanks very much, Inika. Can you tell us a little bit about the assessment criteria? So what are those people in the panel or also hiring managers, what are they looking for? What are the qualities and qualifications that Australian employers are after?
So they will list them in the job ad. So there will be some jobs that require minimum skills. So whether that's training, experience managing a team, whether it's a particular qualification, it will be listed in the job. So you'll be able to see what we call a roadmap. So they've tried to lay it all out of who they're looking for. And that's what you should talk about in your cover letter, your resume, and again in your interview. Those things that they have asked for is what you should be addressing. In terms of what we call soft skills, no matter the job, we want people to be polite. We want people to be on time. We want people to be friendly. So it doesn't matter if you're going for a role that is customer service or you're going to be locked in a room with a computer screen and you don't have to talk to anyone. You still need to be open to being friendly and getting to know people. As I mentioned, our workforce is very diverse. Our population is very diverse. We have lots of people from lots of backgrounds. And so if you can demonstrate your comfort that you have worked with people from different backgrounds, that will be fantastic for an employer. And I think a real benefit of coming from Europe is that you would be used to working with people from all different nationalities, whereas as you either know or you're experiencing, Australia is a long way away. So we don't get that in some smaller companies, but larger companies, absolutely. So they would be my sort of minimum things. If you can demonstrate that you're comfortable and you're excited to work with people from all different backgrounds. You're always keen to learn, so the learning doesn't stop at any age. So you're looking forward to the opportunity and the experience to work in an Australian job market, to work with Australian companies. Those sorts of things are things that we look for in a panel or in any interview, I should say. In terms of the assessment criteria, that will vary depending on the company and the role. The larger the company, the more structured it will be, where we have the questions that we want to ask someone and we actually rate from 1 to 5. So 1 being not suitable for the role by the response that you've given, versus 5 being excellent, we need to hire this person today. Whereas if you go for a role in a smaller company, it could be really laid back. There's no assessment criteria. They just want to meet you, get to know you. The fact that they're meeting with you, they already think you're suitable for the role. So it'll be a lot more casual. They may not take notes, laid back, versus if you're working, as I said, for a large company organization, it's very structured and they will have a rating system that they won't share with you. So they don't tell you, congratulations, you've got a 5 on that question, a 3 on that question, and a 1 on that question. It's something for their internal records when they're deciding between those candidates.
Right, thank you. People are usually very conscious about their accent, and so there is a question about whether there might be a certain attitude from an interviewer in regards to the accent a person may have.
It's really a really interesting question. I love the accent. I think my Australian accent is terrible. There might be that attitude from an interviewer, but my question to you would be, do you want to work for someone who has that attitude and doesn't accept you for who you are and where you've come from? Mm-hmm. I think there are a lot of jobs and employers out there that you can pick from that won't have an issue at all. So it should just be about your fit as well. So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a very interesting talk today. Lots of nice and interesting and up-to-date information about interviews. Thanks for your time, Inika. So next time we have our last seminar in our theoretical part. Next, we're moving on to the group sessions where we're going to work close and directly with people, discussing their resumes and other things. Well, so more on a case-to-case basis. Our next meeting is next Monday, again at 4 o'clock Brisbane time. And the topic is going to be?
So working in Australia. So what I had thought we would cover is things like tax, superannuation, leave, so holidays, all of those sort of topics. So I'd really appreciate if you had anything you'd like us to discuss. If you could put it in the chat or let us know, we will make sure, if possible, as in if I know how to talk about it, that we will include it, because it's really about the next stage. So once you've been successful in the interview, you've accepted a role, love to talk about day one. So what does day one and beyond look like working?
That's very interesting about the specifics of Australian job market. Very, very looking forward to that very much. Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks, Inika, and we will meet next